When teaching about modern times from a book, you have to be aware that these authors, I mean, this book is about 2 years old, folks. Printed up, I believe, in 2011 or 2012, and some of the stuff that they say is already out of date. Yes? I'm looking at page 839. Society and Culture in the Western World. And again, just to remind you, some of this stuff is somewhat out of date because, yes, recent history at least changes. Even ancient history changes. We learn more about it. But recent history does undergo some changes as time goes on. A new society, we call it a consumer society, society of consumerism, where you have factories that turn out a lot of goods that people buy. And it's helped by the fact that in the West, now when they talk about the West, we're talking in this chapter about Western Europe, not Russia, but Western Europe and the Americas. That includes the United States, Canada, and North and South America. That's what we're calling the West. That Western Europe and the United States, Western Europe and the Americas have what's called a consumer society, society driven by consumerism. Generally, wages have risen for the ordinary person, and I'm talking about in real money. Now, anybody know what does an economic person mean when he says real money? Yeah. Anybody?
Money that's backed up.
Money that's what?
Money you have is backed up in gold.
Backed up by a gold standard. That's a good point. Real money, I think a better definition is money that has more, that's the buying power. In other words, what would buy a loaf of bread today, or let's say compared to a gallon of gas. When I was young, gasoline cost 32 cents a gallon. It's now up to about $3.50 a gallon, 10 times as much. Well, if you're making more than 10 times what you made back in the 1950s, then you have more buying power, you have more real money. But if the inflation has gone up faster than your income, then your real wages have gone down. Real wages, real money is where that your money, your income has gone up faster than inflation. And you're a little bit ahead of inflation. Now in the case of gasoline, our income has not, well, actually it has. The minimum wage in the 1950s was $1 an hour. The minimum wage now is
$7.35.
$7.35?
$7.25.
Oh, $7.25. Well, it's $7.25 an hour. Yeah. Okay, minimum wage. So the price of gasoline has gone up faster than our country's minimum wage. So in that regard, we've lost. Now, your book talks about shorter working hours. And again, folk, I want to remind you, I almost feel like this has gone really obsolete just in the last 2 years since these authors wrote the book. It's about shorter working hours and more leisure, and gives us more time for things like ball games and trips to the park and trips to Six Flags or trips to Disney World and things like that. That was more true when the authors wrote this book than it is at the moment. In view of recent events, full-time work is really hard to find. Part-time work is easier to find. The problem is part-time work doesn't pay enough, so you wind up having to take 2 part-time jobs. Hopefully none of you know what I'm talking about, but if you don't, if you're not in that category yet, some of your buddies are. And buying power is less than it was. Now the shorter working hours, again, that's what your book says. That was becoming truer and truer as time went on. I mean, hey, my great-grandfather took a job at a factory and he worked 72 hours a week, 12 hours a day for 6 days. Today, if you work 72 hours a week at a factory, in those days the law did not require that this factory to pay him time and a half for overtime. Today, you can make a good bit of money. I mean, I worked 72 hours a week for a while when I was at Lockheed. It's awfully tiring. But it can give you some pretty big bucks. But in his day, he had to work 72 hours a week, 12 hours a day with no overtime pay just to balance his budget. As time went on, those hours did get shorter. And I wish I could say they're getting shorter still, but from what I've observed with my own children and some of their friends, working hours are starting to get longer. And I don't mean to sound more pessimistic than need to be, but it's estimated that this generation, or your generation, will be the first generation in American history that might have a lower standard of living than their parents. Now, if any of you objects to me saying that or knows different, you're welcome to speak up now. I mean, hey, folk, I don't enjoy saying that, but it's just what I'm starting to observe, that the economy is getting a little bit tighter, and good jobs are getting a little bit harder to find. Moving on. Revolt in sexual mores. I'm looking now, page 840. Permissive society. Permissiveness became somewhat of a popular word for a while. In other words, everybody should be free to do their own thing. Particularly, there was a revolution in sexual morals, which your book says Sweden took the lead in allowing people to do anything they want to sexually. The result has been, among other things, a much, much higher divorce rates. And much higher rates of infidelity. Your book says that they did a survey in the Netherlands in 1968 that 78% of the men and 86% of the women had participated in extramarital sex. Again, I find it interesting that the percentage of women is higher than men. Each of you can decide for yourself why that might be. My own personal take on that, if you haven't guessed already, is I do not think this permissiveness is a good thing, and will eventually pay the price for it. Youth protest. Now, we don't see this going on as much as we did when I was younger, but when I was in college, and even before, when I was in high school, the young people, college-age students, were getting out and rioting and protesting, throwing bricks, throwing rocks, throwing bottles, all in an attempt to protest. Well, number one, they were protesting the war in Vietnam. But another thing they were protesting was college campuses. We don't do this today. But when I was younger, colleges would flunk 40% of their freshmen. Students would get out of high school, enroll into college, and be put in a college classroom with anywhere up from 100 to 250 pupils, all lumped together in one big room. The professor would stand and lecture, and all you had to sink or swim on was sometimes one test. At the end of the semester, the professor would never take roll, didn't know whether you attended or not, didn't care. At the end of the semester, he'd give a final exam, and whether you sank or swim depended on your grade in that final exam. Now, this practice now is looked on as being somewhat unfair. Actually, it is. Sometimes they give a midterm, so you had two chances to pass, a midterm and a final exam, and that was it. And 40% of the students flunked. And 40% wound up flunking out, including a first cousin of mine who almost made it. He had a 1.9 average when he needed 2.0 to stay. Well, the students began to get upset at this, and something else, we'd hear horror stories. There was a case one time where a person engaged in a swim meet during final exams. I mean, the swimming was part of his PE final. And he got stomach cramps really bad to where he could hardly move. Eventually recovered from stomach cramps, went to his next class, found the door locked, knocked on the door. The professor said, "You can't come into my class to take your final. You'll have to repeat the course. You're either going to come in on time, you're not going to come in at all." He wound up failing the course and had to repeat it next semester. Now, I don't think that I could get away with such a practice here. I don't think that's a wise practice or a fair one, but nevertheless, these kind of things went on, and the students became very upset. They wound up taking over the student centers, engaging in sit-ins, engaging in demonstrations, and throwing rocks. The worst part of it came in 1970, in April 1970, in Ohio, when 4 students were shot dead on Kent State University in Kent State, Ohio. And it turned out, I mean, what happened? The National Guardsmen shot them. The National Guardsmen who shot them were being pelted by bricks and rocks and bottles, and they were afraid of being hurt. But the students who were killed were just going about their business, were not part of the rioting. To this day, I don't know if we know who ordered the shots to be fired or why, or if this shows older. There were millions of dollars spent in investigating the situation, books written about it. They had to close down all of Ohio's colleges because the situation got really heated up, and the students were told, come back one at a time and take your finals as you make arrangements with the professor. But for right now, everybody go home, and all the students on the campuses were ordered to leave. Women. I talked a little about women and women's liberation 2 days ago. And again, I guess those of you who heard what I said know my take on it. You can read for yourself what the book says, but I want to add a few things to it. 100 years ago, no, let's make it 150 years ago, women were held to a very, very high standard. In fact, it was called a double standard. They were held to a much higher standard than the men, and they dressed in extremely modest clothing. In fact, during the Victorian era, women covered almost everything except their hands and their face. And men would doff their hats as they passed them by, or stop maybe and play gentlemen for a while, talk to them. Now, you might think that this was ideal. No, the fact is the Victorian women were always complaining about their aches and pains. And this hurt and that hurt, and they were always under the weather, always sickly. Now, I hope I'm not describing any of you, because I don't think today's young women are quite that way. I mean, hey, so believe me, I understand it's this liberation business. But a lot of times, folks, what you're doing is trading in one problem for another. Now, I spent 27 years at Lockheed, and it's not uncommon for a Lockheed young man to refer to his girlfriend as old psycho bitch or psycho. I'm sorry, but I mean, I got to tell you, in other words, basically, we go around in cycles and trade in one problem for another. I'm not advocating the Victorian era women were right. They were hemmed in so tightly with their tight girdles and their dresses that they couldn't move. And when some of them started riding bicycles, that feminism would be ruined, and they wouldn't dare get out and play tennis in shorts. I mean, so but basically, we have our problems too. They had their problems in their day, and a lot of it was just continuous aches and pains, headaches, backaches, this ache and that ache, and we don't know if a lot of the pains were imagined, real or imagined. Again, I hope I'm not talking about any one of you. I must say my mother was that way. All right. Anybody have any comments, folks? I mean, the floor is open. I mean, they gave women the right to vote in 1919. Women were given the right to vote. So what do women do? You'd think they wanted the right to vote, they become active in politics. No, instead they began to go to nightclubs and become flappers, dance girls, exhibitionists. Much more so than they went into politics. A few now went into politics and became politically active, but most of them chose instead to be showgirls. And sexual morality declined farther and farther. All right. Again, I've said my spiel on this. The issue of pay, women still make much less than men in the workplace, and just has been less than 2 weeks ago, it became almost a presidential scandal. The women working for the executive and working for Barack Obama are making noticeably less money than the men are. Did any of you happen to hear about this?
Yep.
You did. Okay, a couple of you had. Yeah, it made some waves a couple weeks ago. I think it's kind of died down now. One of these things you hear about and then it dies down. The president promised to do something to try to make the pay more equal. We'll see what he can do. Terrorism.
So,
Yes.
a few weeks, I'm not really sure, maybe it was a few weeks ago, didn't they deny the bill for the raise of minimum wage?
Does anyone know anything about it?
They did raise federal minimum wage.
They did raise the federal, yeah, each state had its own minimum wage laws.
And the federal state, and the state cannot go below the federal.
There's no state can go, the federal is the law of the land. And no state can go below that. But then each state can go higher if they wish. But no state can go below the federal minimum wage, which is mandated by federal law.